In an old aerial photograph, the fort looks less like a building than a wound in the land. Sharp angles cut into grass. Long earthen faces press outward in perfect symmetry. Inside the geometry, a quiet town sits, as if nothing is strange at all. Streets pass over embankments. Houses stand where cannon once should have watched the horizon. And at the lowest edge, where the stone meets the soil, arches disappear into ground that seems too high, too new, too final. It is the kind of image people glance at and move past. But once you stop and measure what you're looking at, the scene becomes difficult to explain in ordinary terms. Was this really just a fort? Or was it something older that history learned to describe more narrowly? The accepted explanation is familiar. These are bastion forts or star forts, products of the gunpowder age. Medieval walls had become vulnerable to cannon. Military engineers lowered the profile, thickened the ramparts, angled the bastions, widened the fields of fire, and turned the landscape itself into a defensive machine. From Italy, the method spread across Europe and then across the wider world. Kings, empires, merchants, and armies adopted the design because geometry could save cities. That is the official explanation. In broad terms, it is real. The mathematics are real. The artillery problem is real. The historical record does contain engineers, plans, budgets, and campaigns. But that explanation often feels complete only at a distance. The contradiction appears when the fort is treated not as a diagram, but as a physical site. There is the scale. There is the earth moved. There is the way some forts seem stitched into older terrain, rather than imposed upon empty ground. There is the way lower levels vanish beneath later street grade. There is the way official dates often describe a renovation, an enlargement, a redesign, or a military occupation. Not necessarily a true beginning. There are forts said to be early modern, yet seated on foundations, embankments or ridgelines that look older than the story attached to them. And there are cases where the surrounding city seems younger, flatter, and more provisional than the fortified landscape at its centre. So the hidden theory is not that every fort was built by some fantasy empire, or that every archive is a lie. It is narrower, and in some ways more unsettling. The theory is that many forts now described as products of a known military era may have been built over, adapted from, or formally renamed on top of older engineered groundworks whose original function is no longer clear. Not hidden in the dramatic sense, not buried by one grand secret, but absorbed, reclassified, flattened into the nearest acceptable category. A military term can do that. So can a map legend. So can a budget line that records repairs while saying nothing about origin. Start with the most obvious fact. A true bastion fort is not simply masonry, it is mass. Earth, slope, ditch, glacis, retaining walls, casemates, drainage, access roads, magazines, embrasures, and outer works. What remains in many places is not a compact ruin, but an entire reshaped landscape. The walls are low, because they were designed to resist artillery, yes, but that also means much of the structure is hidden inside the ground itself. On paper, this makes the design seem rational and modern. On the ground, it raises another question. How often are we looking at what was built in one campaign, and how often are we looking at older embanked forms that were merely sharpened, faced with stone, and brought into line with later doctrine? The stone remembers. So does the grade. Then there is the map record. A fort appears on one map as a stronghold of strategic importance. On the next, its geometry is cleaner, more formal, more legible. In later versions, the city grows around it. Roads multiply. Civil uses replace military ones. Parks cover ramparts. Government buildings occupy interiors. What the maps often show with great confidence is the fort as a named fact. What they do not always show clearly is the transition from raw earthwork to finished citadel, or the relationship between an old defended site and the later symmetrical form we recognize today. The record shows occupation very well. It records control, taxation, garrisoning, and repair. Origin is less secure. That gap matters. Look closer at old photographs of fortified cities, and another pattern begins to emerge. Doorways seem sunken. Windows sit below present grade. Lower courses of masonry vanish into soil. In some cases, retaining walls appear to hold back a level of earth that was not part of the original design. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Cities accumulate debris, streets are raised for drainage, wars destroy and rebuild, fortifications are partially demolished, and sediment or landscaping alters the apparent base level over time. All of that is true, it does happen, but repeated truth can also become a reflex. When the same explanation is used for every buried arch, every half-covered casemate, every strangely elevated promenade built over older military stone, something else begins to happen. The explanation stops being an answer and becomes a habit. A fair reading of mainstream history deserves to be stated clearly here because much of it is strong. The angular geometry of bastion forts makes sense against artillery. Their protruding points eliminate blind spots. Their low, thick ramparts absorb force better than vertical medieval walls. Engineers from the Renaissance onward did study angles, range, fields of fire, and layered defense with great seriousness. This is not imaginary. The problem is that a good explanation for form is not always a complete explanation for every individual site. A later military science can describe why a fort was reshaped without proving that the entire footprint began in that same period. It can explain the final language of the structure while leaving the earlier grammar unexamined. That distinction becomes sharper when we look at known cases of reuse. Forts were often built where forts already stood. Bastions replaced towers, citadels absorbed castles, earthworks cut across older walls. Roman camps, medieval enclosures, port defences, hilltop redoubts, and river crossings were repeatedly modernized rather than abandoned. This is not hidden knowledge. Historians acknowledge it, archaeologists expect it, and yet the label usually follows the most recent decisive phase. A site becomes an early modern fort because that is when it entered the record in its current form. That is efficient. It is also reductive. Once the site is named, the deeper layers become subordinate details. What changed was the explanation. This is where the pattern widens beyond a single fortress or a single country. Across coasts, river mouths, trade hubs, colonial ports, inland crossroads, and borderlands, similar forms appear again and again. Some are textbook examples, some are irregular, some seem too large for the local population said to have built or maintained them. Some stand in places where the later city appears almost like an afterthought. Others are now so softened by landscaping that their military geometry survives only from the air. The pattern does not disappear, it repeats. Different empires, different climates, different official histories, yet again and again the same visual fact returns. A precise defensive geometry sitting on ground may have had a longer life before the current caption was attached to it. And once you notice that, other categories begin to wobble. Old photographs of quarries, mesas, exposed columns of rock, and abrupt table-like landforms have produced their own fringe interpretations, some of them reckless, some of them plainly wrong. But their popularity reveals something important. People are reacting to the same discomfort. They are seeing forms in the landscape that look engineered, cut, or too deliberate for the quick explanation they have been given. In most cases, geology is enough. Erosion is enough. Igneous columns are not tree fibers. A butte is not a stump. But the speed with which a category closes the case is still revealing. Once a thing is named, inquiry relaxes. The eye stops working. And that same intellectual reflex appears around old forts. Bastion, Vauban, artillery age, case closed. Yet many of these sites contain features that deserve slower reading. There are outer ditches now used as gardens or roads. There are buried vaults whose lower ventilation seems inconsistent with present ground level. There are glacis so broad they resemble civic landscaping more than military necessity. There are walls with masonry styles that do not agree cleanly with the stated date of completion. There are records of endless repair, but thin records of first construction. There are plans showing modifications to old works, though the older works are described vaguely, as if their prior form did not matter. There are also places where later states inherited forts from previous powers and then rewrote the file under their own system, preserving the utility of the site while quietly compressing its history. Engineering itself offers another clue. To create a true fortification network, one needs not only geometry, but surveying, drainage control, labour organisation, material transport, and sustained maintenance. Ditches flood if neglected, slopes fail, brick linings collapse, stone facing shifts, timber rots. A fort is a bureaucratic organism as much as a military one. It survives through measurement, payrolls, inspections, legal jurisdictions and procurement chains. That means the historical identity of a fort often follows the institution that last maintained it, not the hands that first raised the earth. The archive tends to preserve the phase that was administered most clearly. Earlier phases blur because they belong to a weaker state, a local authority, an improvised occupation, or a category the archive did not value. This is why the truth, if there is a deeper one here, would not need a dramatic conspiracy to remain obscure. Inertia is enough. Classification is enough. Military paperwork is built to manage present function, not metaphysical origin. Urban planners flatten old embankments into parks. Restoration projects privilege visible masonry over subsurface logic. Geologists describe the land beneath. Historians describe the war above. Engineers describe the final form. Each field does real work, yet what falls between them can remain strangely untouched for generations. No one has to hide it. They only have to inherit the labels. There is also the problem of visual obedience. Modern people trust the cleaned-up reconstruction, the museum plaque, the neat date range, the digital plan. But the raw site often says something less stable. A fort that should feel like a self-contained military machine instead feels like an edited remnant. A bastion projects from a wall that seems older than the angle attached to it. A parade ground sits above chambers that no longer open where they should. A city street crosses what was once a ditch, but the geometry of the ditch still controls the district as if the town had grown by adapting to a shape it did not originally choose. The record is still there, sometimes in stone, sometimes in absence, and absence can be as telling as presence.